I never imagined it would come to this. If you had asked me a year ago, I would have told you I had the perfect life, a great job, a beautiful wife, and a home that we were both proud of. But somewhere along the way, everything started to unravel. My name is Zane, and I work in IT, one of those typical tech guys who's always busy with new projects and meetings. My days were filled with deadlines, codes, and system crashes. If I'm being honest, I barely had time to breathe, let alone pay attention to the woman I married. Isla, my wife, understood this. At first, I think she thought it was just a phase, something that would pass. But it didn't. She was a freelance graphic designer, managing her own schedule but always in the background, taking care of our home. There were times I'd hear her complain about wanting to work on her portfolio, to break out of the mundane tasks that consumed her days, but I would brush it off. "You'll get there, babe," I'd say, not fully listening. I'd be sitting at my desk, typing away, my mind consumed by lines of code while she was slowly fading into the background. And then, it hit me. I wasn't even aware of how much she was changing. Isla's voice became softer, her presence more distant. The passion she once had for life, for her work, began to flicker out. I know she tried to tell me how she felt. She said she was feeling unappreciated, like she wasn't being seen anymore. But I didn't hear her. I wasn't listening. I was too absorbed in my own world. And then Julian came into the picture. Julian was my childhood best friend. We'd been through everything together. Our first bikes, our first jobs, and even our first heartbreaks. Julian had always been emotionally steady, something I lacked. He had a successful business of his own, but unlike me, he wasn't buried under endless tasks. I always admired him for being able to find balance in life. I never thought much of him and Isla spending time together at first. They'd talk, occasionally have coffee when I was buried in work. I didn't mind, not really. After all, he was family, and Isla was always so friendly, so warm. But soon, I began to notice a shift. She started laughing more around him, seemed to have more energy when he was there. I'd hear her voice, a little brighter, a little lighter, something that I hadn't heard in months, maybe longer. One evening, I stayed late at the office, working on a project that seemed to have no end. Isla and Julian had planned to meet for coffee, something that seemed perfectly innocent to me at the time. I didn't think twice about it. I should have. When I came home that night, the apartment was quieter than usual. I could hear Isla and Julian talking in the living room. She was telling him about some frustration at work, I think. Their voices were calm, almost comforting, but something in the air felt off. I shook it off, thinking I was just imagining things, but I couldn't deny the tension in my chest. As the days passed, I noticed Julian was coming over more frequently, sometimes unannounced. He'd walk in like he owned the place, a casual familiarity that seemed to deepen between him and Isla. My gut twisted every time I saw them together. I tried to keep it together, told myself I was overreacting. But every part of me screamed that something wasn't right. I could tell she was drawn to him, more than just a friend, I think. It was in the way she looked at him when he spoke, the way she smiled. He wasn't just a shoulder to cry on for her. He was her confidant, her emotional anchor. Meanwhile, I was wrapped up in my own world, so consumed by work that I didn't even notice how much of a stranger she was becoming. Isla started asking me less about my day. When she did, I gave her half-hearted answers, barely listening as she shared her own struggles with her freelance work. I knew she was losing herself, but I didn't do anything about it. I didn't know how to. I was tired. I told myself I'd fix it, eventually, but I never did. The first time it happened, when I truly felt the shift, I was at home for dinner. Julian had come over again, a little earlier than usual. I don't even remember what we were talking about that night. It was one of those typical evenings where Isla was venting about her frustrations, and Julian was playing the part of the supportive friend. But that night, it was different. I could feel it. Isla had had a rough day, dealing with an impossible client, and I could see how drained she was. Julian noticed it too. Without saying much, he stood up and walked over to her. He took her hands in his, looked into her eyes for a moment, and in a way that felt too intimate, he gently reassured her that everything would be okay. I should have said something then, but I didn't. Instead, I sat there, frozen, watching the scene unfold. Isla looked up at him, her expression softer than I'd ever seen it before. And then, in a moment that I still can't fully explain, it happened. Julian leaned in. Isla didn't pull back. Their lips met, just briefly, but it was enough. Enough for me to feel my heart shatter, enough for me to realize that something had changed, something had broken. Isla pulled away first, her face flushed, eyes wide. "Zane," she whispered, voice trembling. But I didn't respond. I didn't yell, didn't accuse her. I couldn't. All I could do was look at the two of them. The man I trusted more than anyone in the world, and the woman I thought I knew. I felt like a ghost in my own home. I was lost, drowning in a sea of confusion, anger, and pain. The rest of that night was a blur. Julian left soon after, muttering some excuse. I don't even remember if I said goodbye. Isla and I didn't talk. We barely even looked at each other. That night, we both went to bed in silence, but I couldn't sleep. I couldn't stop replaying the kiss in my mind. And I knew then, everything had changed. It started slow. At first, it wasn't even noticeable. Just a small shift, a subtle change in the rhythm of our lives. But the longer I ignored it, the more it became impossible to deny. Isla, my wife, the woman I thought I knew so well, was pulling away from me. It wasn't like the grand, dramatic fights you see in movies. It wasn't even a conversation. It was the silence that spoke the loudest, the absence of questions about my day, the lack of interest in the small things that had once mattered to her. She didn't care to ask if I was tired, if something had gone wrong, or if I was feeling stressed. Instead, she became distant. When I came home late from work, she would barely look up from her laptop, absorbed in whatever she was doing, as if I was just another piece of furniture. At first, I convinced myself it was just a phase, maybe a temporary crisis. Relationships go through rough patches, right? That's what I told myself. But as the days passed, the feeling of something being off grew stronger. I noticed the way Isla looked at Julian. Like there was more to their interactions than simple friendship. At first, I tried to convince myself I was being paranoid. After all, Julian was my oldest friend. We shared everything growing up. He wouldn't do something like that to me. But then I saw the glances, the long, lingering looks they exchanged when they thought I wasn't paying attention. I felt it in my gut. Something was wrong, but I couldn't pinpoint exactly what. It wasn't like Isla was coming out and saying it, and Julian, well, he wasn't the type to push boundaries. But the little things, the way they stood a little too close, the way her eyes softened when he spoke, those details added up. Isla was more distracted these days. She seemed to have lost interest in trying to rebuild whatever had been slipping away between us. At one point, I tried to ask her if she was okay, if there was something wrong with our relationship, but she just waved it off, claiming she was fine. But I could see it. She wasn't fine, and neither was I. One afternoon, I found myself sitting on the couch, scrolling through old photos on my phone. It wasn't unusual for me to revisit memories, little things that reminded me of simpler times. But this time, something caught my eye. It was a picture, one I didn't remember taking, one I didn't remember seeing before. It was a picture of Isla and Julian at some cafe. They were laughing, their heads tilted toward each other in a way that felt intimate, too intimate. My heart dropped into my stomach, and I immediately opened the gallery to find more. There were more pictures, all with the same theme. Isla and Julian, together, their smiles genuine, their eyes soft and knowing. I scrolled through the pictures quickly, the pit in my stomach deepening with every click. It was clear they were spending time together outside of the house. Private moments that felt too personal, too intentional. But it wasn't just the pictures. It was the text message that I found when I accidentally tapped on the wrong thread while going through my phone. It was from Julian. I don't know why I opened it, or why I kept reading. Maybe it was a moment of weakness, but I'll never forget the words. "Why can't we be together, Isla? We know it's right." In that moment, the world around me stopped. Time froze, and all the thoughts I had been pushing away, all the questions I'd been avoiding, came crashing down in a single instant. I didn't even need to see the rest of the conversation. It was clear. She had crossed a line. They had crossed a line. I put my phone down, my hands shaking, my mind spinning. I knew what had happened, but I couldn't bring myself to admit it. Part of me wanted to confront her right then and there, but I wasn't ready. I wasn't prepared for the truth. So I just sat there, numb, letting the reality of what I had just discovered sink in. When Isla came home later that evening, I tried to act normal. I didn't want her to know that I knew. I didn't want to give her the satisfaction of seeing me weak. But she wasn't blind. She could tell something was wrong, and when I finally couldn't hold it in anymore, we sat down and tried to talk about it. I'll never forget the way she tried to justify it. "It wasn't like that, Zane," she said, her voice trembling. "It was just emotional. You don't understand. You've been so distant. I needed someone to talk to." She tried to explain it away as if it were just some minor slip-up, a lapse in judgment. She denied the physical side of it, tried to make it seem like nothing more than emotional weakness on her part. But the more she spoke, the less I believed her. I could feel the wall between us growing taller, brick by brick, as the truth became harder and harder to ignore. "I never wanted to hurt you," she said, her eyes filled with guilt. I just felt so alone, Zane. And Julian, he listened. He made me feel like I mattered. My chest tightened with anger, with pain. "So what? You think I don't care? You think I haven't been trying? I've been working my ass off for us, and you? You were getting closer to him. You were getting everything from him that you were too afraid to ask me for." She looked away, her eyes filled with regret. "I didn't mean for it to happen like this. I swear." But I couldn't hear it anymore. I didn't want to hear it. I had to get away from her. I stood up and walked out, slamming the door behind me. I couldn't look at her anymore. I couldn't stand the sight of her. I felt like everything I had built, everything we had been, was a lie. That night, I didn't sleep. I couldn't sleep. My mind raced, thinking about all the moments I had missed, all the signs I had ignored. And the worst part? I still loved her. Despite everything, I still loved Isla. But that love felt like it was slipping through my fingers, turning into something darker, something that I didn't recognize. The betrayal had cut deep. I didn't know what would happen next, but I knew I couldn't just let it slide. Not this time. There was a part of me, probably a bigger part than I'd like to admit, that wanted to scream at Isla, demand answers, and tear everything apart. I had so many questions, so much anger burning in my chest. But instead of confronting her, instead of sitting down and trying to piece our broken marriage back together, I chose a different path, a darker one, a path of revenge. I couldn't erase the betrayal, couldn't pretend that everything was fine. It didn't matter if Isla was sorry, or if she explained how emotionally distant I had been. I was tired of excuses. So, I made my decision. I started spending more time with Lena, Isla's sister-in-law, Elliot's wife. Lena was a strong woman, someone who had her own struggles, her own emotional battles. She was dealing with her own personal crisis, just like I was. She had always been friendly, but it was only in the wake of my hurt that we really began talking. I didn't need to pretend around her. I didn't need to wear the mask that I had been wearing around Isla for so long. Lena listened. She understood in ways that Isla no longer could. Every conversation with Lena felt like a balm to my soul. She had a way of offering comfort without saying much. Just her presence, her support, was enough. Over the next few weeks, we spent more time together, talking about our struggles, about our lives. It was never about us. It wasn't about attraction or desire. It was just companionship. But as time went on, something changed. Lena's warmth started to feel more like what I had been searching for all this time. She became my emotional support, and I started to realize that she was filling the void that Isla had left. It wasn't just revenge anymore. It was something deeper, something more complicated. I started to look forward to seeing Lena. I started to care about her in ways that I hadn't planned. It wasn't love, not yet, anyway, but it was something that made me question everything I had ever known. Was it possible to start over with someone else? Could I even forgive Isla, knowing what she had done? Meanwhile, Isla was completely unaware of what was happening. She kept trying to reach out to me, trying to fix things, to apologize. But I wasn't interested. Every attempt she made to make amends felt hollow, like she was just going through the motions. I had already moved on, in my own way. I was still angry, still hurt, but I wasn't interested in reconciliation. What I had with Lena was different. It was real in a way that my marriage with Isla had never been. But of course, Isla eventually found out. It was inevitable. Nothing stays hidden forever. She heard about Lena and me from Elliot, I think. Maybe Lena mentioned something in passing. Or maybe Isla noticed the way we were spending more time together. Either way, it didn't take long for the truth to hit her like a ton of bricks. When she confronted me about it, it wasn't the screaming match I had expected. No, it was worse. It was the silence. The look in her eyes, broken, betrayed, empty, was the only thing I could see. She didn't say much at first, but when she finally spoke, her voice trembled with a mix of pain and desperation. "You're doing this to hurt me, aren't you?" Isla asked, her eyes searching mine for something, anything, that resembled the man she once knew. I didn't respond. What was there to say? Was I doing it to hurt her? Maybe, but I also didn't care anymore. She had crossed a line that I couldn't ignore, and now I was no better than her. I was playing my own game, taking my own revenge. The difference was, I wasn't ashamed of it. I didn't want to apologize. Not now, not after everything she had done. "I never wanted this," Isla continued, her voice breaking. "I never wanted to lose you, Zane. I made a mistake. A huge mistake." Her words stung, but not in the way I expected. I wanted to feel vindicated, to feel like I had won some kind of victory, but all I felt was empty. I couldn't bring myself to care about her apologies anymore. Not when she had already chosen Julian. Not when she had already given away the love we once shared. "You've already lost me, Isla," I said, my voice cold and distant. "You can't just take it all back with an apology. It doesn't work like that." Her face crumpled, and I watched as tears started to well up in her eyes. But I didn't feel sympathy. I felt nothing. "Please," she whispered. "Please, Zane. I'm sorry." But I couldn't say anything more. I didn't have the words, and I didn't want to. I turned away from her, not because I was angry, but because I was done. I had nothing left to give. Isla's heart was still beating for me, but my heart had already stopped. It had stopped the moment I discovered her betrayal, and now it was too late to fix anything. We couldn't go back to what we had before. Too much had happened, too much had changed. As I walked away from her, I felt the weight of everything settle on my shoulders. I wasn't sure what was going to happen next. I wasn't sure if I could ever forgive her. But I knew one thing for sure. There was no going back. The aftermath of the wreckage left by Isla's betrayal was hard to ignore. I thought that taking my revenge on her, finding solace in Lena, would bring me the satisfaction I was seeking, but it only deepened the ache inside. The problem was that I wasn't really looking for revenge anymore. I was looking for something that would fill the emptiness she had left behind. Something that would restore what I thought I had lost. But nothing felt whole. The more I tried to convince myself that Lena was my answer, the more I realized I wasn't really sure what I wanted. For Isla, the loss of everything, her family, her marriage, her sense of self, left her in a place where she had to start over. I could tell that she wasn't just hurting from the breakdown of our marriage. She was hurting from the loss of the life she thought we'd have together. She took the first steps toward rebuilding herself. I heard through the grapevine that she'd moved into a small apartment of her own. It was nothing extravagant, just a modest space in the heart of the city. She was trying to regain some sense of independence. She started attending therapy, pushing herself into creative workshops, maybe hoping that doing something for herself would somehow make her feel whole again. I almost felt sorry for her, but then I remembered what she had done. My sympathy was a hollow thing. Despite her efforts to move forward, Isla couldn't escape the feeling of emptiness that clung to her like a shadow. Her attempts at growth felt like attempts to fill a void that only grew larger the more she fought it. Her relationship with her father, who had never liked me, was deteriorating. He began urging her to let go of the past. He told her to move on, to release the chains of her broken marriage. I could only imagine how difficult it must have been for her, hearing the man who had always disapproved of me now speaking with such authority, demanding that she let go. But Isla couldn't. She wasn't ready to let go, and I wasn't sure if she ever would be. Meanwhile, Lena and I grew closer. She had become a constant in my life, and despite my internal struggles, There was something undeniably comforting about having her around. She listened to me, supported me, and in many ways, she made me feel understood in ways Isla no longer could. But as the weeks went on, I started to sense a tension between us. Lena, too, had her own battles to fight. She had always been open about her emotional struggles, the complexity of her marriage with Elliot, and the sense of guilt that weighed on her for being with me while her husband was left in the dark. But it wasn't just guilt. There were moments when I saw the same doubts in her eyes that I had seen in myself. Was she truly with me because of the connection we had? Or was she just another way for me to escape my broken marriage with Isla? I never openly admitted it, but I knew Lena was beginning to feel the strain of our relationship. I could see it in the way her smile faltered sometimes, or in the way she would hesitate before calling or texting me. She had become an emotional support for me, but I couldn't shake the feeling that she was becoming entangled in something that wasn't healthy. I knew I was torn between the past and the present, between the woman who had betrayed me and the one who had entered my life as a way to retaliate, a way to hurt Isla back. One night, after an awkward silence between us, Lena asked me a question that had been hanging in the air for weeks. She looked at me with a quiet intensity and asked, "Zane, do you still have feelings for Isla?" The question struck me harder than I expected. I wanted to say something, to reassure her that what we had was real, but in that moment, I couldn't. I didn't know. I had been so consumed with my own anger and pain that I never allowed myself the space to truly process my feelings for Isla. The truth was, a part of me still loved her, even if I resented her. That part of me still wanted her back, even though I knew I could never trust her again. And here was Lena, someone who cared about me, who was trying to be my emotional anchor. But my silence spoke volumes. Lena, perhaps sensing my hesitation, pulled back. Her face softened with a mixture of disappointment and resignation. I could see the hurt in her eyes, but she didn't say anything. Instead, she asked to be left alone for the night, and I complied. The next day, I found myself once again questioning everything. Was I truly with Lena because I cared about her? Or was she just the answer to my revenge? Was I using her to fill a hole that Isla had left in my heart? The more I thought about it, the more confused I became. Lena had given me something real, but I wasn't sure if I had ever been completely ready to embrace it. And then Isla showed up at my door. She came to me, finally, after months of silence. I hadn't seen her since that last confrontation, and now, here she was, standing in front of me with tears in her eyes. She was broken, but I didn't feel any satisfaction from seeing her like this. There was no joy in her pain. She came with a single purpose, to beg me to take her back. "I've failed you, Zane," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "I know I've hurt you. I know I've destroyed everything, but I still love you. I'm sorry for what I did. Please, let's fix this. Please, let me try." I wanted to yell at her, to tell her everything I had been feeling, how betrayed I felt, how much she had shattered everything we built. But instead, I just stood there, cold and numb. She had destroyed us, and now she wanted to piece it all back together. But it wasn't that simple. It would never be that simple. "No, Isla," I said, my voice devoid of emotion. "You chose to break us. You made your bed, now lie in it." Her face crumpled, and for a moment, I saw the woman I had once loved. But it wasn't enough. It would never be enough. Isla didn't beg anymore. Instead, she left, and in her absence, something changed in me. I had gotten my revenge. I had watched her beg, seen her pain, and yet, I felt nothing. The emptiness that had consumed me was still there. I had destroyed everything for what? For some fleeting sense of power? I had built a wall around myself to protect myself from her betrayal, but now it was just a cage. As I sat alone that night, I began to question everything I had done. Had my revenge healed the wounds, or had it simply deepened them? I was left with nothing. My anger had burned out, and all that remained was a cold, empty space in my heart that no amount of retaliation could ever fill. I realized then that the pain had become cyclical. Every attempt at healing, every confrontation, every decision, had only perpetuated the cycle. I had no answers, just scars, and the remnants of a life that was now unrecognizable. It's strange how life moves on, even when you think it has stopped. After the final confrontation with Zane, I spent months in a haze of confusion and heartbreak. It felt like I was trapped in a never-ending loop of regret and despair. I had no one to turn to, not even my family, who had started to distance themselves from me. I was a mess, and I knew it. I had broken everything: my marriage, my sense of self, and my future. But over time, I started to change. Slowly, very slowly, I began to pull myself out of the darkness. The isolation I had chosen became my salvation. At first, I didn't want to see anyone. I couldn't bear to face the people who would judge me, the ones who still whispered behind my back about what I had done. But eventually, I came to realize that I couldn't keep running from myself. I had to face what I had become. Therapy was a lifeline. I didn't expect it to work at first. How could anyone understand the mess I had created? But through the long sessions, the endless hours of talking, I began to piece together what had happened. I had let my insecurities rule my life. I had allowed fear to drive my decisions, and in doing so, I had betrayed the one person I had once loved. Zane and Julian. They were both casualties of my own need for validation, my inability to confront my own fears. What happened with Julian wasn't love. It was a response to my own weakness, my desire to feel seen, heard, and important. I wanted someone to fill the void Zane had left, but I was only looking for distraction. I couldn't run from the truth forever. I was the one who had destroyed everything. And when I finally accepted that, when I forgave myself for my mistakes, something shifted within me. I knew then that I had to move forward. I couldn't hold on to the past, no matter how badly I wanted to fix it. Zane wasn't coming back, and honestly, I didn't think I wanted him to. The love I thought we had was tainted beyond repair, and no amount of regret or guilt would bring us back together. So I let go. I packed away the remnants of our life together: photos, letters, gifts, and put them in a box that would stay hidden in the back of my closet, a symbol of everything I had lost. I focused on myself, on rebuilding who I was without the label of wife or lover. I started going to creative workshops again, dedicating time to my art, something I had neglected for so long. For the first time, I felt like I was truly living for me. Zane, on the other hand, wasn't done yet. The walls of his emotional cage had started to close in on him. I had heard whispers about his relationship with Lena and how it was falling apart, just like everything else he had tried to hold on to. From what I gathered, Lena had finally realized what I had suspected all along. Zane wasn't ready to move on. He was still stuck in the bitterness of our past. I wasn't the only one trying to heal from our failed marriage. Zane was carrying the same weight of regret and guilt that I had been carrying for months. He eventually sought therapy, something that surprised me. I never thought he would take that step, but maybe it was the wake-up call he needed. Maybe he was starting to understand that revenge doesn't fix anything. It only adds to the pile of broken pieces. I couldn't help but feel a little relief for him, knowing that he was trying to work through his own pain. But it didn't change the fact that our marriage was beyond repair. Months later, I ran into Zane at a mutual friend's gathering. It was one of those awkward moments when the past catches up with you. He was standing alone by the punch bowl, looking exactly the same, yet somehow different. When he saw me, there was no immediate recognition of the pain we had shared. No harsh words, no accusations, just distance. We exchanged polite pleasantries, but it felt like we were strangers. Zane's coldness was met by my newfound strength. I had spent so long trying to find closure, but now, I realized that closure wasn't something I could get from him. I had already closed that chapter on my own. I didn't need his apology or his understanding. "I'm glad you're doing well," he said, his voice distant. He offered a half-hearted apology, but it didn't matter anymore. I had moved on. "Thank you for the lessons," I replied, surprising even myself with how calm I sounded. I wasn't angry. I wasn't hurt. I was free. Zane stared at me, his eyes searching, but I didn't give him any more. I had no more to give. I thanked him for the lessons, both the good and the bad, but I had learned all I needed to. I had to move forward, without him, without the past. After that night, I didn't see Zane again. Our paths had finally diverged. He had been a part of my life, yes, but he no longer defined me. He was no longer the center of my universe. My new beginning was far from easy. It was messy and uncertain, but I knew that the strength I had been searching for all these years was finally inside me. I started traveling more, visiting places I had always dreamed of. I met new people, people who saw me for who I was, not as someone's wife or someone's ex. I began to rebuild my career, focusing on my art and pushing myself to create in ways I never had before. I even made new friends, real friends, not people I had clung to for comfort. And yes, I began to consider new relationships, though this time with more self-awareness and confidence. I was no longer defined by my past mistakes or my failed marriage. I was becoming the woman I had always wanted to be, but never had the courage to embrace. The journey wasn't easy, but I could feel myself healing. I no longer carried the weight of regret and guilt. I had let go of the ghosts that haunted me, and for the first time in a long time, I felt free. And so, as I walked alone through the park one morning, looking up at the clear blue sky, I realized something. This was my life now. I had come out of the darkness and into the light. I was stronger, more resilient, and finally, ready to embrace whatever came next. The cycle was over. I had left the past behind, and I was ready for the future.